hour, and then we can open it up for discussion. The title of my talk is Global Recession, the New Cold War, and the Rio Olympic Games. And what I'd like to do is to more or less situate the current Olympics within that geopolitical, geoeconomic context. Just a little bit about my sporting background. I'm a former middle distance runner from the 60s. And my first major track meet that I attended was in 1962 at Stanford University when the United States competed against the Soviet Union. And I think the third major dual meet between those two countries. And it was at that moment that I realized that sports was also political. There was no way to separate the two. Over the years, even though I taught U.S. government and international relations, I always kept an interest in following sport on a global level. And over the years, I've written a number of articles that deal with that topic. Most of the articles have been about the Olympics. As long ago as 1976, I wrote a piece for a journal on the Montreal Olympic Games. And just most recently, last year, I wrote an article that was published in the Toronto-based journal Socialist Register 2015 on the nature of the International Olympic Movement. If anybody's interested in reading that article, if you give me your email address, I can send you a copy of it. I've also attended 5 Olympic Games, mainly track and field, which is my passion, although I haven't watched a few other sports. And I've also been to 12 of the 15 World Track and Field Championships as well. So I follow the sport very closely, but also try to look at it within a geopolitical context. I think the first thing I want to say is just to make a few comments about the Olympics, but more importantly, I think more accurately, the International Olympic Movement. I think most of us in the room have some idea of its history. It was started in the late 19th century by a French aristocrat, Baron de Coubertin, and his purpose at the time was to rally young people together for 2 basic reasons. One, to promote physical fitness. His personal motivation was that in 1871, France was defeated by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, and he had a strong belief that one of the reasons why France lost was its lack of physical fitness. So military preparedness was always on the agenda. But at the same time, with the rise of industrial monopoly capitalism in the late 19th century, urbanization and working class, et cetera, he felt that sports and the Olympic movement could create a quote-unquote brotherhood for people around the world. Although in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the world was basically Europe, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina. That was about it during the early stages. There's a long history as to the origins and who was involved in that. Certainly the philosophy of the founders were 19th century ideas of classical liberalism, volunteerism, amateurism, etc. And many of you in the room know about the transition from amateurism to professionalism in international sport over the last 30, 40 years, and I have a lot of knowledge about that process as well. The philosophy of those individuals also very sexist as well. It wasn't until the 1980s that we see women being co-opted into the Olympic movement, although the percentages are still relatively small compared to male participation. Another point about the International Olympic Movement was it always argued that it transcended politics, that it was above politics. And one of the rationales for the Olympics being held in various cities over the years has been that this has nothing to do with politics. Of the Berlin Olympic Games, And the Olympic leadership, led by, at the time, Henri de Ballet Latour, argued very strongly that the games are above politics and the Olympics will be held in Berlin. Also, the head of the American Olympic Committee at the time, Avery Brundage, who became a major figure in the Olympic movement, was strongly behind that boycott. After the war, we see the Olympics sandwiched within the context of the Cold War. And between 1952 and 1988, we see that that Cold War, the Olympics became literally a Cold War arena between those two ideological systems. And the line was who won the most medals won the Olympics, which meant that their system was the best. Now, the interesting thing about it, the Soviet Union generally won the most medals total because the Soviet Union included women in the count, where the United States only included men. So the US always won the men, and the Soviet Union always won the total competition. There were two Olympics where there were exceptions, but that was generally the rule. So both systems could argue they were the best system of all time. That Cold War arena obviously blew into major, major tensions, leading to the US boycotting the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. And some 57 nations participated in that boycott. I wrote my PhD dissertation actually on the Carter administration and its role in fostering the new Cold War. And that Olympic boycott was central to the propaganda that the US used to begin to confront the Soviet Union at that time. In 1984, the Soviet Union boycotted the Los Angeles Olympic Games, not for tit for tat, but for specific things that the Reagan administration was doing in 1984. So we see the Olympics highly politicized during that period. Since the 80s, basically, we've seen the Olympics being enmeshed in geoeconomic realities on various levels. For example, in 2004, Athens was given the Olympics, and some have argued that the amount of money and debt incurred by the Olympic organizers in Athens in 2004 had some role in the ongoing economic crisis in Greece that still is with them and us, I guess. Another side of that is that in the 1990s, we see the emergence of the so-called emerging market economies. And in the 90s, and certainly in the early 2000s, many of those economies organized around an organization called the BRICS. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the BRICS. That's some 5 nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and in 2010, South Africa was brought into the BRICS arrangement. These were economies that were growing quite dramatically. They were articulating and calling for a multipolar world as the United States was trying to maintain as it continues to a unipolar orientation to its global hegemony. Interestingly, the Olympic movement has chosen several of those BRIC countries to host its events. Obviously, China in 2008 with Beijing, which was kind of an opening. It was presented as China emerging as a major power in the 21st century. Sochi was picked in 2014 for the Winter Olympics. Obviously, Russia is a major player in the BRICS movement. At the same time, as we'll comment a little bit later, the U.S. has targeted Russia for regime change, and it's using every possible strategy to force regime change on Russia, including NATO encirclement of Russia as we speak. I would also argue that this banning of Russian athletes from the Olympics is part of that strategy as well. And certainly we have Brazil, which is a major BRIC country hosting the Rio Olympics. But it's not just the IOC or the International Olympic Movement that's picked BRIC countries. The FIFA picked South Africa in 2010 and 2014, Brazil was also picked to host the World Cup. And Russia is slated to host the Cup in 2018. Although I've written several articles that have been posted online last year arguing that this U.S. Justice Department investigation of FIFA has more to do with trying to have Western agents take over FIFA to find a way to ban Russia from hosting the 2018 World Cup than it has to do with corruption, and we can talk about that later. But interestingly, one other agency, my sport, International Track and Field, the IAAF, has also picked BRIC countries in the last few years for hosting mega sporting events. In 2013, Moscow hosted the World Championships, and I was fortunate enough to attend those competitions in 13. And also 2015, the World Championships were held in Beijing. Unfortunately, I had tickets, airline taken care of, in hotels, but I had to get back surgery, so I couldn't go. And the back surgery was pretty rough, but I was extremely disappointed by not being able to attend. Luckily, the television coverage was fairly good. It wasn't like being there by any stretch of the imagination. So I think that's some of my introductory remarks. I think the core of what I want to talk about is that as I've argued, that the Olympics is integral to politics. There's no way to separate the two. And probably the most tumultuous and controversial and significant politicized Olympics was the Berlin Olympic Games. There's a number of books about those games you can easily find, and it's a fascinating read. But I would argue that this Olympics probably supersedes Berlin in many ways because of the enormous complexity of political and economic and biological issues involved. And so I think some of those are fairly transparent, and I think the mainstream media even covers them not well necessarily, but doesn't ignore many of those things. Obviously, the political instability that's going on in Brazil at the moment, the impeachment of President Rousseff for allegations that are not valid. The question is, what is that about? There's obviously enormous class struggle going on in Brazil. It's been going on for quite some time. Interestingly, it emerged dramatically around 2013 when Brazil hosted the Confederations Cup, which is kind of the preview for the World Cup. There were millions of people in the streets protesting against Brazil hosting not only the Confederations Cup, but also the World Cup. And the slogans are pretty obvious, you know, money's for the World Cup or money's for the Olympics, but no money for health, education, and public housing. That goes on to this moment. In fact, there's a website you can find that lists all the demonstrations that are going to occur in Rio and elsewhere in Brazil immediately prior and during the Olympic Games if you want to. And I think I have it listed somewhere in my notes. Might take me 20 minutes to find them, but they are there. Also, the country is beset in enormous economic problems. It's argued that the recession, they call it a recession, it might be a depression, is the worst in maybe 100 years. Certainly it's the worst since the Depression. The economy contracted 3.8% last year. It's estimated at least 3.5% this year. Some 276,000 jobs were lost between 2014 and 2016. The indices just go on and on to where yeah, the unemployment rate in the last year has jumped from 6% to 11% in the country, based on figures that I've read. So the economy is beset as well. Now, most of the commentaries, and I saw a lecture the other night by a progressive sports scholar at the Green Arcade bookstore, and all of what was discussed about Brazil, and some of what I just mentioned was discussed, it was always just focused on Brazil and what was happening inside Brazil. But my main point I'm going to try to make today is the events that are happening in Brazil politically and economically, and the Olympics are caught up in those things in a symbiotic way, are part of a much larger set of geopolitical processes that have been underway for quite some time. And as we speak, they're increasingly coming to a head. The two major processes that I'd like to comment on that has Brazil situated or sandwiched between, or amongst, if you will, are one, the U.S.'s strategy of trying to achieve global hegemony, absolute global hegemony. This is a process that got underway as soon as, well, actually before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and we've seen it continue to escalate as we speak. And the prospects of the next two presidents, particularly the Democratic president, tells me, and especially the appointment of her vice president, is that project is going to just simply accelerate. And we're talking about no-fly zones over Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So don't smile next week if the tone of the Democratic convention is lighter than the Republican convention. The discussion about the pursuit of absolute hegemony is a very vast subject. There's tons of material out there to read. This is something that I've taught and studied for maybe the last 50 years. And even though I'm retired, it's infectious. There isn't a day that I don't spend a couple hours reading websites trying to figure out what in the hell is going on, you know. But I guess in a nutshell, to talk about that is at some point, you could argue exactly when, but let's say 9/11 is a good point to start. At that point, the United States began to accelerate its strategies to promote regime change in Russia as well as regime change in China, because that's, to me, the basic objective here. And this project has had a lot of different names and labels, and there are policy statements and documents that are written by various foreign policy think tanks, by certain agencies within the federal government. Obviously, the Project for the New American Century, which some of us are familiar, some of you may be familiar with, articulates some of the objectives of the United States, and I would argue they're deeply embedded in U.S. policy making. But some of the processes and labels are the NATO expansion would be one of them. The pivot to Asia in 2009 under Obama and Clinton. The war on terror is obviously part of that strategy, to say the least. Just a comment about the Middle East. I'm influenced very strongly, believe it or not, by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Some of you may know Brzezinski. He was Carter's national security advisor. And since I spent about 7 years of my life doing research on Carter, I got to intimately know his thinking, okay? He's actually written a book that I think everyone should read that was published in 1997 called The Grand Chessboard, where he adopts the ideas of a British geographer by the name of Halford Mackinder. Mackinder was writing at the early stages of the 20th century, and he had great influence with the Foreign Office at that time, and much of British foreign policy in the early parts of the 20th century were shaped very strongly by Mackinder. Mackinder's premise, which sounds like a children's rhyme, but I think it must be taken very seriously, and that is, one, who controls the world island? Let's see, who controls the heartland controls the rimland, and who controls the rimland controls the world island. And the heartland is Russia and China, okay? The rimland is all of the periphery, Central Asia and the Middle East and Europe. And the world island is Eurasia and Africa, the largest landmass in the world, the largest populations, the most natural resources, and the most populations, and therefore the most markets. And so Brzezinski in '97 lays out a plan for U.S. foreign policy. And I would argue very strongly that everything that's happened in the last 15 to 20 years can be understood by understanding the template that Brzezinski laid out in that book. Obviously, the regime change in Middle East, and certainly, if not regime change, destabilization, has great impact on China and Russia in a variety of ways, and we see that as we speak. And again, the overall goal is regime change in Russia and China. But I think an interesting sidebar that is where the direction we want to go in our talk is that as the U.S. under Clinton and Bush, and now certainly Obama, but I would argue mainly during the Bush administration, with the focus on the Middle East, if you will, the so-called rimland, according to Brzezinski, a window was opened for Latin America to make some moves away from the Washington consensus, or what we know better as neoliberal policies implemented by the major financial organizations, World Trade Organization, IMF, the World Bank, et cetera. And what we see are these so-called populist left movements throughout South America. It's starting in the early 2000s. Venezuela is probably the one that we know most about, Hugo Chavez. The Workers' Party in Brazil, led by Lula, and then obviously Ms. Rousseff was his chosen candidate to be the president. But we also see Evo Morales in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and also in Argentina. We see great movements towards some kind of regional, if not continental, cooperation to try to loosen dependency on the U.S. and the U.S. economy, more involvement in trade with China. And as we see the rise of prices for commodities, particularly oil, during the early 2000s, we see economies all over the world, including Russia, grow quite dramatically. And Brazil, because of its size and its economic might, and obviously its resource base, was the economic engine. I would argue that Venezuela is more or less the architect of this strategy, but Brazil was probably the economic force behind it. We see Brazil becoming a member of the BRICS, okay? And what I want to argue here is that under the Bush administration, we see a preoccupation with the Middle East, but once Obama came into the White House with Clinton as his Secretary of State, we've seen a refocus, if you will, towards Latin America. As we see the rise of this strategy of the pivot to Asia in 2009, the goal of this strategy has been to, quote unquote, reverse the Bolivarian Revolution. This is obviously a generalized project, but it's also a case-by-case project. The objectives are, again, to have regime change in these countries, to institute governments, if not clients, that are willing to abide by what is now called the new Washington Consensus. to institute neoliberal policies, to weaken if not sever, the economic ties with China, and to push more authoritarian policies towards the overall populations. And so I think you can see already where I'm headed to. It seems to me fairly clear that the so-called impeachment of President Rousseff can more adequately be called a coup d'etat. Pepe Escobar, who's one of my favorite writers, has called it a part of a hybrid coup, if you will. There are all kinds of tactics to cause regime change. Obviously, direct military intervention, which happened in Iraq under Bush. We have more political-oriented strategies, the so-called color revolutions that have occurred in many of the East European countries and several other countries around the world, where you see a combination of local elites, capitalist elites, oligarchs, who generally have significant control of domestic media, demonizing the political leaders, demonizing the politics of those leaders. You see the Open Society, George Soros Open Society, and other foundations bringing in non-governmental organizations with the objective of teaching people on the ground I can't even say the word, democratic techniques, et cetera, and to call for more open societies and more foreign capital. I think the Cuban strategy is happening right as we speak as well. And then eventually there are these big demonstrations that call for democracy or whatever, and we see this overthrow of a legitimately elected government. We saw this in Ukraine in 2014. We've seen it in Georgia, was in Ukraine in 2004, et cetera. That's one. Escobar argues that the Brazilian strategy, because of the democratic tendencies and the awareness in Brazil and the scale of its economy, that wasn't going to work. So what we see, from my vantage point, people may differ with this view, depending on what you read, but even the New York Times is beginning to acknowledge that this is what happened, is that the oligarchs in Brazil used the political process of impeachment to get rid of the elected government. Keep in mind, some 54 million people voted for her in 2014 in a re-election. And they quickly, this Michelle Temer, who, by the way, was up for investigation for corruption in the so-called car wash crisis, quickly came into power, and he kicked out the entire cabinet and brought in a very homogenous cabinet, rich white males, in a country that over 50% of the people consider themselves Afro-Brazilian, if not native populations, and quickly disbanded many of the social policies, social welfare policies of the Workers' Party, and has instituted neoliberal strategies. I think what some people could argue that, so what? I mean, this is internal events, but I would argue very strongly that the individuals involved with this, Temer, Nunez, and others, the foreign policy secretary, have actively worked with the State Department in carrying out this mission. And in fact, very interestingly, Alicio Nunez, who is was the vice president candidate for one of the losing parties in 2014, and has been the foreign minister. He's the head of the subcommittee for foreign affairs in the Brazilian Congress. The day after the impeachment, he quickly went to Washington and met with a fellow by the name of Thomas Shannon, who is the #3 person in the State Department, the #1 Latin American expert, the individual that had the ear of Obama and Kerry, and was also the ambassador to Brazil the previous 3 or 4 years, and was in the State Department during the 2002 Venezuelan attempted coup, the 2004 Haitian coup, the 2011 Paraguayan coup, and obviously the 2012, no, did I get that? Paraguay was 12. There was another one in Haiti in 2011. So I think you kind of see the linkage there. So this political instability that is occurring in Brazil, I think has direct connections with this overall strategy of the United States' pursuit of absolute global hegemony. Underscoring all of this is the other process, and that's global recession or global depression. And I just want to make a few very brief comments about this. I think there's three separate but interrelated causes of this global recession or global depression, depending on what position you fit in the economy. I think one, it's the cause is related to the inherent contradictions of capitalism, and the two most obvious are the tendency towards overproduction and underconsumption, and the other is the tendency towards the centralization and concentration of capital, i.e. inequality related to income and wealth. The second is, and a companion to those contradictions and others, is the implementation of neoliberal policies based on deregulation, privatization, smashing unions, cutting social services, et cetera, projects that are rampant throughout the world and certainly in this country. And then thirdly, actual economic manipulation. And I think the best example of that is when the Saudi Arabians manipulated oil production, driving down the cost of oil several years ago, which I believe very strongly, and I think there's enough literature to back me up here, worked very closely with the United States. And I personally believe the major goal was to weaken any oil exporting country that was not towing the line to U.S.'s neoliberal policies, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly the main target was Russia. And Brazil was hit as well with this too. And so Brazil is sandwiched in these two processes. There's internal contradictions and class struggle, and the Olympic movement, the Olympic Games, is situated right in the midst of all of that. Now, underscoring all of that is this biological crisis that is very interesting. I have one of the greatest nephews that could ever live on the planet, my nephew Clark. He's a Marxist, a radical, a medical doctor out of UCSF, and he's one of my best friends, and we talk all the time, including yesterday. And I said, what's this about this Zika virus, okay? I don't know if any of you, I'm not a student on this by any stretch of the imagination, but the virus has been known for a number of years. I think it was first discovered in Uganda in 1946 by Western scientists, but it was always isolated, and all of a sudden it's just kind of proliferated throughout Latin America with Brazil as the centerpiece. Now, whether this is owing to natural processes, including population migrations, et cetera, or it's being manipulated by the National Health Institute, I can't answer that, okay? But all I know is that it has played a big role in the destabilization of Brazil at this point. Brazil is in a crisis. I guess I want to conclude before we have a few questions as to the Olympics themselves, okay? By the way, on a personal note, I did not go this year. I'm not going for a bunch of reasons. One is my back. I can't travel, and I've already bought tickets for the World Championships in London next year, okay? So my back better be ready. They're getting expensive. You got to get them early now. But here's, in the article I wrote for Socialist Register a year and a half ago, so I had about 5 conclusions. I've added a couple more since in the last week or so. Even though there have been calls for postponing or moving the Olympic Games, which is not for the, this is not, these are calls that have happened before. And in fact, in 2003, I think it was the World Swimming Championships or Gymnastics Championships were moved from China because of the SARS epidemic, by the way. So it's not unprecedented for these mega sports activities to be moved because of these epidemics or potential epidemics. But there was no way the IOC was going to move away from Rio. There's just too much money to be made. And I can talk about how much money in a moment if you want. The Olympics will go on a schedule. One, the security will be massive. There will be 85,000 police and military personnel policing Rio during the Olympic Games, which is twice the number that were at London. There were games with minimal security, by the way, prior to Munich, but largely because of the Black September hostage crisis. The security increased, and I went to Montreal in '76, and I can attest to you how dramatic that was. But part of the security is also dealing with the gentrification of many of the areas where Olympic facilities have been built, meaning poor people have been relocated, quote unquote, it's a nice mild word, to other areas. Estimated some 76,000 people have been moved to build Olympic facilities. Many of these facilities, specifically the Olympic Village, a number of high-rises have been given over to a fellow named Henrik Calavar, I think that's his name, for his private use, and he plans to sell them on the market after the games, and each unit apartment is supposed to go for about $2 million. So that's underscoring that, and obviously the military has been used for these evictions as well. International or global economic interests will benefit, and local capitalist interests will benefit enormously. The Olympic movement, I guess I can make some comments here. In fact, part of the article I wrote for Socialist Register focused on this very point, because up until the late '70s, the Olympic movement was a non-profit organization. The elites in the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, were aristocrats and militarists and former politicians, et cetera, who were quite comfortable, and they paid their way. But during the '70s, owing to the structural crisis that occurred during the '70s, the International Olympic Committee faced a dramatic moment. Its future was imperiled because cities increasingly were not bidding to host those games. In fact, the '76 Winter Olympics were supposed to be held in Denver, and the Denver Organizing Committee, being forced by environmentalist movements around Denver and other progressive political forces, forced Denver to renege on its bid, and the games were moved to Innsbruck. In 1978, only one city bid to host those games, and that was Los Angeles. But at the same time, the citizens of LA, there'd been a referendum, and the city had voted that there was no public funds to be used for the '84 Olympic Games. So it is at that point that a tourist entrepreneur by the name of Peter Uberoff, you probably have heard his name, was picked to be the head of the LA Olympic Committee, and he came up with a privatization model where we were going to sell sponsorships to corporations, as well as the IOC decided they were going to take over control of television revenue or negotiations. To give you some idea, in 1972, the IOC earned, I think, $150,000 from the Munich Olympic Committee for television revenue. In 1984, the International Olympic Committee got 33 million from Los Angeles, which was the first privatized game. Between the quadrennial cycle between 8 and 12, the IOC earned $4 billion in television revenues. Its total revenue base in that 4-year cycle was $8 billion and is slated to earn about $9 billion during this Olympic cycle as well. So clearly the Olympic movement became a corporate franchise, just like McDonald's, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no, NBC, the contracts are signed with NBC and you can't move. The games have to go on regardless of the pollution in the bay or regardless of the Zika virus. The fourth point, I think, is that the some 350,000 foreign visitors who will go to Rio will wine, dine, and spectate in insulated security. And again, that's the second reason why I didn't go, was I went to Atlanta, and to give you some idea of the tickets for track and field. 9 days of track and field cost me $500. I went to London, it was $500 a day. And it was, pardon my, well, I'm not going to say anything dirty. They were horrible seats, okay? They were about as high as you can get. Although I will say that the night of the 100 meters where Usain Bolt ran, I could have sold my ticket for 10,000 pounds, okay? 10,000 pounds. That's how much I love track, okay? I'm serious about that. Somebody, I know a guy that would give you 10,000 pounds. I said, no, I'm sorry, man. I got to see Usain run, man. This is his story, The fifth point is that the class struggle will go on during the Olympic Games and it will continue, which means that the internal crisis will continue in Brazil. As I just mentioned, again, that the IOC will go to Rio as soon as Rio is up, because in the contract, by the way, that the IOC forces on the local host committee is the IOC has no liability for costs and any problems that happen during the Olympic Games. So they'll pack up and they'll head to South Korea for the Winter Games in 2018. And Tokyo, the Fukushima Games, will be held in 2020, okay? And the IOC will earn a lot more money. And they know this for sure because in May 7th, 2014, the IOC signed a contract with NBC Universal, which I think is Comcast now, for $7 billion to host 6 Olympic Games from 2022 to 2032. And so they're well taken care of up until the 2030s. The only thing that's going to undermine the Olympic Games will be nuclear war, collapse of capitalism, or ecological devastation, because the Olympic movement will not deter. And also the two processes that are sandwiching Brazil will continue, and that's the U.S. pursuit of global hegemony, which I believe is leading towards world war with Russia, and the economic crisis, because capitalism has no solution to the problem. There's no solution. It can't be reformed. And so, we're in a period of what Rosa Luxemburg called either socialism or barbarism. And with that, I'm going to end my remarks. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions, comments, rebuttals? Yes.
What was Brzezinski's book again?
The Grand Chessboard. Okay, 1997.
What is who is liable for athletes and so forth contaminated by Brazil experience in these Olympics?
That's a good question. The athletes themselves, I think, basically, and how they're going to prove where they got the virus from or whatever, the host committee is liable for loss, economic loss.
Brazil.
In Brazil, no, well, it's actually technically the city. The Olympic movement only gives the Olympics to specific cities that have what is called an Olympic organizing committee. Okay, and so that committee is generally formed by local people, always elites.